And thank you all for inviting me to join you tonight. I'm going to go ahead and use this microphone. I don't have Rocky's booming voice or his soaring oratory. I'm a bit more low-key, so I'm going to use this, although I do appreciate Rocky going first. I always like my audiences to be well-fed and slightly buzzed before I take podium. I'm going to keep my remarks brief so we have plenty of time for questions. I find that generally a group like this who is engaged in the issues of the day have lots on their mind, and I learn as much from them as they do from me at this when we have these opportunities. I'm going to start out tonight by quoting President Barack Obama, who I think had the wisest statement of 2009 when he told Republican Congress members, elections have consequences. And elections certainly do have consequences. We've learned that in 2009. We have been paying the consequences of the 2008 election all year. And we will probably be paying the consequences of that election for many, many years to come. I'm going to recap a little bit the year we're just now finishing, 2009, and then look ahead a bit to 2010 and what I expect to see before we go into questions. It certainly has been an extraordinarily eventful year. We've had the historic presidency of Barack Obama, and I consider it historic, not because he's the first African-American president, but because he's the first president in 35 years to be elected having run on a far-left agenda. Every president since Jimmy Carter has had to run from the middle to get elected to the White House, because that's where the American people tend to stay, somewhere around the middle. Going into this election, the country was right of center, and yet Barack Obama ran on a liberal platform and won this election decisively. And I wasn't among those who said, well, he will govern from the middle, even though he's running from the left, he'll govern from the middle. You didn't have to listen to this guy very long to know he was what he appeared to be. He is what he appeared to be. He didn't fool us. He was the same Barack Obama on the campaign trail as he has been in the White House. He's also the first president in decades to come into the White House with a Congress under his full control, or the full control of one party, his party. The Democrats have a decisive majority in the House, and the House is dominated by liberal leadership. He has a veto-proof Democratic majority in the Senate, and the Senate is controlled by a liberal leadership. So the stars were aligned when he came in to pass the most sweeping liberal agenda this country has seen since the Great Society days of Lyndon Johnson. And that's what they set about doing in Washington. That's what they continue to do in Washington, even though polls are now showing that 2/3 of the American people don't want what they're cramming down our throats. He's ignored popular opinion, declared a mandate for himself and his policies, and is ramming through extreme programs, extreme legislation that none of us would have believed 2 years ago this country would have stood for. Started right off, as soon as he took the oath of office, he took over the American auto industry. And I know many of you here probably work for General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. Who can believe what has happened to these companies, particularly General Motors and Chrysler, which are no longer private enterprises, but are branches of the White House, are branches of the federal government. He obliterated bankruptcy laws, destroyed the free market, use the concept of too big to fail to place the government in a dominant position over private industry, and has now set up a landscape, a business landscape in this country where nobody knows what the rules are. He completely wiped out the rule of law when it comes to bankruptcy, when it comes to bondholders, etc. We've seen an interference in the free markets that we haven't seen since the days of Roosevelt and Truman. I mean, think about what he did to General Motors. Fired the CEO. Completely ignored the wishes of a board elected by shareholders. Replaced that board with his own appointees, and is now deciding everything from marketing strategy to the kind of cars they build, to where they'll build them, to who sells them. Don't believe it when he says, I don't want to run an auto company. He's been running an auto company now for 6 months, and we'll all be lucky if he doesn't run both of these countries into the ground. Government has rapidly emerged as the dominant player in our economy. We spent the last 25 years or so living under the sort of wisdom of Ronald Reagan that the government is not your friend. The government is not here to help you. And yet now there is no more powerful entity in our country than the federal government and then the White House. I mean, we saw when these automakers went down to Washington and sat before Congress, we saw the way private CEOs were treated, the hostility, the anger, the hypocrisy. Asked about flying down to Washington in private planes with Nancy Pelosi sitting there spending upwards of $10 million a year on a private jet, military jet, to fly her back and forth to California. Asked about, they and the bankers, asked about their reckless management of these companies and their financial, their lack of financial acumen by the likes of Barney Frank and Chris Dodd, who conspired to create the credit and mortgage crisis that brought this country to its knees. And still this week, you had Barack Obama dragging the bankers who are desperately trying to pay off their loans so they can get control of their businesses back, dragged him into the White House and put all of the blame for the financial collapse on their enterprises, on their leadership. He told them they were responsible for the recession, they were responsible for the job losses. Never mentioned Mr. Frank or Mr. Dodd, who had their hands so deep in those bankers' pockets and ignored their responsibility to oversee and make sure things were running as they should be. We have now reached a point in this country, or we did reach a point in this country, hopefully it's changing, where we felt business was the enemy. The CEOs were our enemy. Wall Street was the bad guy, and government was the savior. Now, I'm not going to stick up for any of those Wall Street bankers, CEOs, but I've been around long enough to know that government officials are not the guys wearing the white hats. And yet, for much of this year, the majority of the American people believed that they needed bigger government, that they needed a more dominant government, that they needed a more active government to protect them from the free markets, to protect them from business, to protect them from the CEOs. I don't know how many times I've listened to NPR commentators, read in Newsweek or the New Yorker or the Atlantic Monthly,